Canada recently leaked a plan that might actually end Canada. I'm not exaggerating. Canada's upcoming tariff relief plan might actually cause Canada to fall, not the tariffs themselves. Let me explain. So just to quickly go over what's happening, it appears that the United States is putting in a 25% tariff on most Canadian products, if not all, potentially excluding oil depending on what the Republican Party is feeling like in any given week. So the United States is implementing a 25% tariff on most, if not all, Canadian products. However, the one on oil may come and go because, well, Americans love their oil. And also because 20% of all oil consumed in the United States actually comes from the oil sands in Alberta. In fact, almost 2/3 of the crude oil in the Midwest and 90% of the crude oil in the Rocky Mountain states come from Alberta. Meaning that if tariffs were to be placed on Canadian oil, which they look like they probably will be, life in the northwest of the United States might get almost as expensive as it is in Canada. But regardless, whether the tariffs include oil or not, and whether they change in the coming months or weeks after they're implemented, it would still be devastating to the Canadian economy. A study from Oxford showed that these tariffs would easily push Canada into a recession. However, the irony is that by pretty much every metric except for the standard total GDP contraction metric, Canada has been in a recession for a couple of years. It's also a recession that the Emperor of Canada refuses to acknowledge, but that's besides the point. In all honesty, these tariffs could cause an economic depression, not just a recession. So let's talk some numbers here. It's estimated that these tariffs alone, which is only 25% right now, could cause Canada's GDP to fall by 2.5%. Now, just for perspective, anytime GDP growth is negative for 6 months in a row, that is the traditional definition of a recession. And if you were to look around at a lot of the developed world right now, most economies are growing at less than 2.5%, meaning that these tariffs on Canada would single-handedly catapult most countries into a recession if the impact were to be the same on any developed nation right now. So these tariffs are big. So inflation is expected to surge to well over 7% within the first 6 months of these tariffs. And by that, I mean the fake inflation that the government tracks because, well, they lie about these numbers all the time. Inflation for the average person tends to be well over what is stated by the government because things like rent and housing inflate drastically, like they did by 60% from 2020 to 2022, meaning that the average inflation during those years was somewhere around 6%. Meanwhile, the average person was feeling about a 15% per year inflation. But anyways, inflation will be surging in Canada quite soon, so that's great. What else? Well, unemployment is also expected to skyrocket from these tariffs. It's estimated that Canada's unemployment would hit around 8% from these tariffs. However, this report is a little bit old, and Canada's economy has actually gotten worse since then. So expect Canada's unemployment to be nearing 9%, or about the same level as it was during the 2009 financial crisis at its peak. But don't worry, this is going to be fine. Everything's going to be fine, right, guys? But as a result of this, along with Canada's economy and real GDP per capita compared to the USA falling off a cliff, the Canadian dollar has tanked to its lowest level since the tech bubble and the war on terror in the early 2000s. But anyways, the expected effects of these tariffs are most likely going to be catastrophic. Now, they will hurt the American economy as well, but not nearly as bad as the Canadian economy. So, Canada is looking to do two things in response. One is to do counter tariffs, and two is the tariff relief plan, which is really the core reason why I'm making this video. But let's tackle number one first, the counter tariffs. Now, this is a hot topic for a lot of Canadian citizens, but not so much of a hot topic for politicians. You see, counter tariffs are being proposed that would likely make all of those numbers that I just showed you even worse. Trudeau says he plans on doing a dollar-for-dollar retaliatory tariff on the United States, and particularly targeting sensitive goods to the United States like retail goods, food, cars, and potentially even streaming services. That's right, your Netflix streaming account might get tariffed in the next few months, so just keep an eye out that for the next time you want to watch anything on there. Now, the point of these counter tariffs is to try to leverage themselves against the United States in hopes of reopening a free trade deal and making trade, well, free for both countries once again. However, many Canadians do not want this because, well, everything would get a lot more expensive. You see, Canada doesn't really make anything anymore. Something that I've mentioned a lot on this channel is that the largest portion of Canada's economy is real estate, and its manufacturing portion of the economy has been declining for decades. It's tough to get an exact estimate, but nearly 25% of Canada's economy in 1970 was manufacturing. Today, it's just 9%. Canada doesn't make most of its products anymore. So a counter tariff on American goods would essentially mean a price hike on almost everything you find at a retail store. And considering that Canadians are already the most indebted people in the world and struggling to get by in this dumpster fire of an economy, things could get real bad real fast. But even after all of that, all of the tariffs and the counter tariffs, arguably the most potentially worst thing to come from this could actually be the tariff relief plan of Canada. You see, it was sort of leaked that Canada could see a pandemic level of financial aid and a relief plan that they say will just help alleviate the pain of Canadians facing the tariffs. This would once again come with giving free money or loans to millions of Canadians and businesses, just like what happened during the pandemic. Sounds great, right? Everyone loves some good old free money. However, this plan would come with some catastrophic monetary policy. Assuming that they are truthful and essentially do something similar to replicating what the government did during COVID, it could result in the true death of the young middle class in Canada. That's because during the pandemic, the government started printing money, as it did all around the world, but for Canada, its M0 money supply increased by 350%, its M1 by 50%, and its M2 by 45%, and that is still climbing. And if you don't know what those money supply numbers mean, it just means that the government of Canada turned on the money printers, which devalued the Canadian currency, while keeping the economy afloat by making sure asset prices of stocks, real estate, gold, and a lot of other things increased and stayed high. Essentially, their money printing scheme tried to prevent a recession at the expense of everything becoming more unaffordable. And this disproportionately affected young people, the poor, the middle class, and those that don't own homes. During all of this, they also cut interest rates to 0.25%, which will likely happen again if the tariffs really hit hard. And they did this to make sure that, again, real estate and the asset markets stayed hot. And on top of that, the government took on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of debt in order to prevent businesses from failing for about 12 months after the pandemic and the lockdowns. And this debt will be paid off by the younger generations for decades to come. In a sense, Canada's monetary policy in 2020 made everything substantially worse for everyone who wasn't rich and everyone who didn't own a home. And well, apparently the government didn't learn their lesson because it seems that they are going to do the exact same thing again. One of the sad jokes that I make often in my videos is that the Canadian government would rather see the country literally burn to the ground than see housing prices fall by 3%. And it looks like we are on the same track once again. The government will be putting in policies to ensure that future generations will never be able to climb the economic ladder. Home prices could skyrocket, food prices could go up, stock prices climbing, everything will go up except for wages, the amount of jobs that are available, and the hope of the young Canadians. So I know that this is all theoretical, so we're going to break down some numbers here about the worst case scenario about what could actually happen with this tariff relief plan. And just FYI, because the details on the tariff relief plan are still a little bit foggy right now, it's okay to be hopeful that things will not be as bad as I am about to say. And I would say it's highly unlikely, but again, we're just going with the early leaks and reports. So if you remember, housing prices rose by 60% in Canada after the last time this monetary policy was put in place. So if you were to do that now, well, the average house price right now in Canada is $724,000, and the median personal income in Canada right now is just $42,000. So if you wanted to buy a house on your own and you're making that median income, well, it's impossible, because the average house price is 17.5 times the yearly income of a single median working adult. But let's just take a look at the numbers and see what would happen this time. Well, we're assuming that wages would increase by about 4%, which is what happened over the 2 to 3 years after the pandemic. And now taking a look at home prices, well, the average home price in Canada over the next couple of years would inflate to $1.15 million. Essentially making the average house in Canada more expensive than the average house in Toronto today. And speaking of Toronto, you could see the average house prices rise from about $1.1 million to $1.65 million. All of this while the median income would likely be about $44,000. That's 37.5 times the median income to afford the average house. So why is this so important? Well, it's because buying and owning a home was the #1 way that the previous 3 generations used to build wealth and have a nest egg. But in this scenario, the only people who would be able to afford homes would be those that already own them, or were born into a family that owns them. This would truly be the worst economic mobility in the history of Canada, and arguably the worst in Western civilization since the Industrial Revolution, and potentially since the 1600s, where feudalism was still a thing. And to put that in perspective, the 37.5 times median income to house price ratio, in the 1970s, the average house price to the median income ratio was about 3 to 4. And we might be seeing 37.5. So in a sense, if all this goes through, Canada will likely be a feudal society, but don't you worry. You just have to be born into a family that already owns land or owns a house, and then you'll be fine. And for all of you thinking out there that, hey, all you have to do is just earn a little bit more money, get a better job, okay, let's do some math here. If you're a doctor and you make $200,000 a year as a family doctor, well, the average home price in Canada would still be drastically unaffordable under this scenario. You would need to be making about $280,000 a year just to buy the average house. So, good luck. But also one more thing, with the government taking on more debt, the future generations who don't own a home would also be paying off the debt and get less government services than the previous generation. And this is also too combined with things like, yes, they'll be paying off the debt, but things will be more expensive. So there will be more things like homelessness, crime, and tons of other negative things as well. And if people get unhappy enough with the current situation in Canada, well, maybe because of this, there may actually be a significant secession movement to separate from Canada. And maybe if things got bad enough economically for the whole country, and you, your family, and friends do not have any future prospects, and you had the option of, let's say, I don't know, joining the United States and getting bailed out by them, well, would you do that? A lot of people would. Maybe those Trump jokes about Canada becoming a 51st state could become a reality, despite how much Canadians do not want that to happen right now. However, a horrible economy is usually enough to make people get desperate and make impulsive decisions. And who knows, maybe that's what the Republican Party and Trump wants. Maybe instead of using these tariffs as leverage in the next trade deal, maybe he actually does want to make Canada the 51st state. As mentioned in some of my other videos that you can check out, the reason why Texas and Hawaii joined the United States was almost solely because they had a horrible economy, and Hawaii's specifically was as a result of American tariffs. But I won't get too much into that right now. If you want to check out those stories, look at some of my previous videos, as I've done entire coverage on those things. But anyways, I personally don't think things will get as bad as I just said from the tariff relief plan, because, well, I'm hoping that the Canadian government isn't stupid enough this time to repeat what happened during the pandemic. But, this is the Canadian government, and maybe their solution for this will involve opening the borders again and letting in 1 to 3 million people a year in order to fix the economy. And hey, that worked out well last time, right? The Canadian economy is doing so great that we added so many people. Might as well just do it again. But anyways, what do you guys think of the potential tariff relief plan being a potential pandemic level spending plan? Let me know in the comments below. See ya.